Welcome to the Explainer. Today we're diving into the incredibly complex and honestly kind of mind-bending world of translating ancient texts into entirely new cultural contexts. I mean, think about the sheer magnitude of this task. You're taking a document written thousands of years ago in a totally different part of the world and trying to make it make perfect sense to someone living today? Okay, let's kick things off with a pretty fascinating puzzle. Imagine trying to translate the word snow for someone who has only ever lived in the tropics, or, trying to describe a desert to someone who's only seen lush rainforests. How on earth do you effectively translate concepts that just don't exist for the listener? It's a massive linguistic roadblock, and it happens literally all the time when translating foundational ancient texts for global audiences. So, to figure out how the experts actually solve this, we're going to follow a clear roadmap today. We'll cover the translation dilemma, categorizing the unknown, the translator's toolkit, the whole borrowing versus inventing debate, and finally, the actual stakes of translation. Let's start right at the core of the problem with part 1, the translation dilemma. Drawing from the incredible work of translation expert Dr. George Payton, we really needed to find what we're actually dealing with here. He defines unknown ideas as concepts from a source text that simply do not exist in the target culture. Before you can even attempt to translate a term, you have to do some seriously deep research to figure out not just what the word meant originally, but what exact elements of that meaning can actually transfer over to the new audience. And, a perfect example of how slippery words can be is the word house. Think about it. If you read House of David, your brain probably pictures a family lineage or a whole nation, right? But if you read Peter's house, or oikos in Greek, that triggers a completely different frame of reference. You're picturing a literal, physical building with walls and a roof. Translators absolutely must know which specific sense is being triggered before they can even try to find an equivalent. Which brings us to part 2, categorizing the unknown. Just what exactly is missing? Well, the sheer volume of unknown ideas that translators encounter is honestly staggering. It's not just one or two tricky words here and there. We're talking about entire categories of life. Translators have to figure out workarounds for plants and animals, like lions, bears, or sycamore trees. They have to explain what an ocean is to mountain people. They have to translate ancient weights like a cubit, Roman coins like a denarius, government titles like centurions, and massive abstract religious concepts like holiness. It's a huge puzzle. Take the concept of weather, for example. How do you translate winter or ice to the Orma speakers in Kenya? As Dr. Payton notes, their environmental frame of reference is completely disconnected from ancient biblical weather. They generally experience 3 seasons: hot, hotter, and hottest, along with cycles of long and short rains. The concept of freezing winter simply isn't a thing for them. So, how did they pull this off? Let's dive into part 3, the translator's toolkit, and look at the practical solutions. Now, translators don't just guess or, throw darts at a dictionary. They use a highly structured methodology. First, they investigate the semantic overlap. Then, they choose the path of least resistance so the translation actually feels natural. And finally, they apply a strategic linguistic workaround to get the point across without taking absolutely anything away from the core message. One major tool in their kit is the descriptive phrase. Sometimes a single word just doesn't exist, so you literally just have to describe what the thing does. Dr. Payton shares this great example. Initially, when translating the word yeast for the Orma people, the team had to use the phrase, "a powder that makes bread swell." It completely gets the job done. But, as you can imagine, relying on long phrases can get a bit clunky if you use them for everything. So another tool is just going generic. If a specific item doesn't exist, you zoom out. For instance, there's a famous story of Zacchaeus climbing a sycamore tree. But if your target language doesn't have a word for sycamore, does the exact species of tree actually change the meaning of the narrative? Not at all. So translators would simply write that Zacchaeus climbed a tree. Boom. The message stays perfectly intact. But then, sometimes you absolutely have to be hyper-specific. Take Mark chapter 6, where Jesus has a crowd of 5,000 sit down on the green grass. In Papua New Guinea, a translation team was totally stuck because they didn't just have one word for grass. They had 15 different variations. They had to very carefully pick a word that specifically meant a soft kind of grass. Why? Because if they picked the wrong word, readers might think Jesus cruelly forced a massive crowd to sit down on sharp thorns. No way you want to make that mistake. So the crucial point here is finding cultural equivalents that paint the correct picture. If a culture doesn't have snow, saying white as snow means nothing to them. Instead, you adapt it to white as milk, because milk is their universal standard for whiteness. Similarly, if there are no lions in a region, comparing an enemy to a prowling lion just falls flat. But translating it as a prowling, dangerous animal instantly communicates the exact threat the original author intended. And this brings us to a really interesting crossroads in the process. Part 4, borrowing versus inventing. How do you find the right word when nothing quite fits? I absolutely love this analogy from Dr. Payton. He says, language is like water that runs downhill. It takes the path of least resistance. It's so true. Ultimately, people will naturally gravitate to whatever term is easiest for them to adopt and use repeatedly in their daily lives. So let's look at borrowing first. In some Bantu languages in East Africa, there was actually no generic word for a high god. Clans worshipped specific ancestral spirits, the river, or in some cases even a turtle deity. Translators obviously couldn't risk using a local word that would make people think God was a literal turtle. So they borrowed the widely recognized Swahili word, Mungu. It safely represented the concept of a high god and instantly cleared away all that local ambiguity. But hey, if borrowing fails, you can just invent a word entirely, a neologism. It sounds radical, but we do this all the time today, right? Think of words like email or hard drive. Well, in biblical translation, William Tyndale was famous for this. When translating into English centuries ago, he realized he had no words for certain concepts, so he literally just made them up. Words like scapegoat and Passover were completely invented by him to fill a conceptual gap. And now they're just completely normal parts of our everyday language. Finally, let's take a step back and examine why all of this linguistic gymnastics actually matters. Part 5, the stakes of translation. We really have to ask a serious question about the balance of this work. What is the tipping point where a translation actually breaks down and fails the very people it's trying to reach? Like, what happens if you borrow way too many Swahili words or too many Greek terms in a local translation? Well, Dr. Payton uses a fantastic analogy for this. He says borrowing foreign words is a lot like adding salt to a meal. A little bit, it perfectly enhances the flavor. But if you dump an entire shaker of salt into the food, it's ruined. If you borrow too much, the target culture will open the book, look at it, and just say, this isn't our language. And the real tragedy is, when they reject the language of the translation, they completely reject the message itself. Ultimately, this whole explainer really leaves us marveling at the incredibly radical nature of cross-cultural translation. It's this masterful, delicate balancing act, bridging massive gaps in time, geography, and culture just to make the unknown perfectly clear. It challenges us to ask, is there any linguistic task more radical or honestly more deeply human than making a 2,000-year-old message speak perfectly to someone in an entirely new world today? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning how the words you read every single day actually came to be.